Hi, so I made a bunch of really weird candies from other dimensions for my video trying candy from other dimensions, part 4. And now I'm going to show you how I made them all. So each of these candies came with their own unique challenge, and some of them would take weeks to make and then only appear on screen for a few seconds. But the first one I want to talk about is the scruttle. So when the scruttle moves, it's actually a stop motion puppet. So a stop motion puppet will have an armature inside, which is essentially a kind of skeleton that allows you to manipulate and animate the puppet over time. This one has an armature wire skeleton inside, which makes it quite difficult to literally bite in half. So the solution I came to with the scruttle was to have two separate scruttles. One was a stop motion puppet that I can animate, and then the second would be the scruttle cut in half with its insides on display. And to build this puppet, I first had to sculpt him out of monster clay. I began by building a cardboard base wrapped in foil, and then I coated this in monster clay to be the underlying base shape. And then I sculpted his face and blended it into the body, and I attached his little monster clay legs. And once sculpted, I then prepared him for the mold making process. Making a mold for him was a little bit of a nightmare because I was going to struggle to get the latex all the way down into the mold to fill the legs. So I needed to build a wet clay base that kind of allowed for holes in the end of each leg. So I could pour latex in the main part of the sculpt and make sure it was working its way into the little leggies as well. And once I had this wet clay barrier, I then coated him in plaster and built up the actual plaster mold. And then when dried, I removed the wet clay, the monster clay, and the cardboard insides. And cleaned out the mold so it was ready to pour the latex into. And then I left the latex to set for a couple of days, and then it was done. I removed the latex from the mold. So then I needed to build a custom armature that would sit inside the stop motion puppet. So I did this by taking some armature wire and using a drill to twist it into a kind of corkscrew shape. And this makes it stronger than just a single piece of armature wire. I built a spine and then an individual leg for each leg coming off the spine. And then I reinforced the joints on the armature with polymorph plastic just to hold them in place a bit better. So then I glued the armature into place and sealed up the holes in the underside of the leggies with liquid latex. And then I stuffed around the armature with cotton wool. And I glued on a patch of latex onto the underside to seal up his tum-tum. So then for the scruttle that I was going to chomp in half, I used the mold to pour another one, which I took out and then chopped his head off. And then once his head was chopped off, I gave him a paint job. So I gave him a base coat of white paint with the airbrush, and then various different blues for the skin tone. And then I started building the cross-section of the scruttle that would be revealed once I bit him in half. And then I made a plaster mold of this again. And then poured latex into that. And then I painted it up and slotted it into the severed body of the scruttle. So then in the edit, I bring the scruttle up to my mouth and then cut to the next shot where the severed scruttle is already in my mouth and put it away. And that's how I faked me biting a latex stop motion puppet in half. It's movie magic. So next was the pixel chew, which was probably the hardest part of the whole build process. Definitely the most time consuming. So the pixel effect was created by me wearing a pixelated mask over my head. And I began by building that. So I took a plaster cast of my head, which I'd made earlier, then coated that in monster clay. The next step was to build hundreds of tiny little clay cubes. And then once all the cubes were sculpted, I started sticking them onto the head with liquid monster clay. And then when I stuck all the cubes on, I realized I'd run out of cubes. So I made more cubes. And I stuck those cubes on. And then I think I did that again. Cubes! So many cubes! And then I reached a point when I finished the cubes, and there were no more cubes. So I brushed the whole sculpt with some Murphy's oil soap as a mold release agent, which works really well actually. This stuff helps the clay come out of the plaster mold easier, and it smells really damn good actually. I'm not gonna go ahead and huff soap on camera. It's not setting a good example, but it smells good. don't huff soap. Once the soap had dried, I applied a really wet coat of plaster to get in all the recesses of the cubes, because after spending all those hours making cubes, I didn't want to lose any of the detail in the sculpt. And then once this initial kind of detailed coat of plaster had dried, I then did many more layers of plaster and mixed some hessian in the layers to give it a bit of rigidity and like reinforcement. So once the plaster had dried, I then disassembled everything and tried to remove the sculpt from the mold. However, what I hadn't realized was that when I made the plaster mold, I actually made it so it began to wrap around the back of the plaster head. So I couldn't actually pull the plaster head out of the mold. So I couldn't use the mold. The plaster head was stuck, wedged in there. So after I cried a bit and I cursed the cube gods, I had to take a handsaw to my beautiful plaster mold to cut the head out of it. I didn't know if I was going to completely destroy this mold. There was a chance I could have made a wrong move and lost like a week or two's work in one go, and I would have been sad. I eventually got the plaster head out. The mold was kind of probably 80% all right. The stuff I had to cut was more around the back of the head. It was okay in the end. At the time, it was pretty terrifying, but I got the head out and I removed all the monster clay out of the mold, and once it was all cleaned, I could pour the latex in and then relax. I started off with a really runny coat of latex to get in all the holes and the details in this plaster mold. And then after that had dried, I added on some thicker coats of latex to give the mask some stability. And then once it was dry, obviously, I removed the latex from the mold and cut open the eye holes and the mouth holes. Then I could start painting this beautiful mask. I airbrushed the entire thing with a pink base coat to try and match my skin tone, which actually I didn't get right and makes it more obvious, I think, in the video that it was a mask. Once I'd done the skin base tone, I did a red watered down paint wash over the whole thing to try and make the recesses of the pixels look a bit sore and stand out. And then when that had all dried, I did some red airbrushing to pick out various details on the mask. And the final gross touch was to add some hair. So I took an old wig I had and snipped up the hair and then kind of glued that on randomly in place and made it look as gross as I could. And that was really annoying to film with because I didn't glue the hair on very well, and as I was filming, all the hair was shedding everywhere. Actually, still finding the hair now. There's one right there. 4 months later. 6 months later. Some months later. What do you want?
I'm down here!
What?
I just couldn't help but notice you're talking about how you build these things, but you haven't read out a materials list yet.
Oh, you noticed, did you? Yeah? It's because I'm not doing one.
What?
Look, let's be honest. Everybody knows I use the same materials in each of my videos, so there's not really much need for a list, is there? And look, every time I do invite you on, you take over the video. Do a piss in my shoes or shoot me with a crossbow or something.
Yes, sorry about that.
So you can probably understand why I don't really want to do one this video, okay? Anyway, so next I can... Ow!
Hello!
Go on then, where have you brought me now?
This is the materials realm, where everything is materials.
Yeah, it's pretty magical.
As you soon will be too.
Wait, what? Great. And how come you haven't turned into a photograph?
Because I am materials. Your flabby body doesn't fit in this realm, but I can traverse both worlds. I'm like the Daywalker, but for materials.
I see. Why did you bring me here?
To teach you a lesson.
That I should always read out a materials list?
I guess. I don't really know. Okay, you go now.
Sorry about that. That felt a little unnecessary. Anyway. So for the little sweetener slug, I just basically sculpted him out of monster clay. He was quite fun to sculpt, his little back holes and bits and bobs. I really like this sculpt, actually. I made a plaster mold of the sculpt, waited for that to dry, and then poured the latex in, and then when the latex dried, pulled out the latex, and made these antennae out of armature wire and cotton wool and latex. And then once that had dried, I stuffed him with cotton wool. I sealed up his underside with a piece of dried liquid latex that I glued in place. And then once he dried completely, I did his paint job. I painted him with a mixture of different shades of brown, airbrushing, and paint washes. That is one handsome slug boy. So you may have noticed that these videos take quite a long time to make, and the main thing that keeps my workshop running in between videos is support from my patrons. So I've started a kind of fortnightly workshop scrapbook vlog that will show you what's happening in the weeks or months between videos in the workshop as I'm building puppets and props. So if that interests you and you want to help keep the workshop going, then head on over to my Patreon page, because I couldn't keep doing this without my patrons. I love you guys. You give me money. So next is flavor creams, and the challenge with them was to try and work out a way of making different colored creams rupture or burst out of a lump of flesh. So I sculpted the lump of flesh base shape out of monster clay. And then I could go in with my various skin texture rollers and tools to try and create a realistic looking flesh texture on the top of this lump, this mound of flesh. And then when the sculpt was finished, again, I made a plaster mold of it and then poured latex in and waited for that to dry and then removed the latex from the mold. And then I trimmed up the edges of the latex ready to give it a paint job. And then to make the flavor cream, I actually used yogurt with various food coloring dyes to change the color of the yogurt. I don't know why I opted for yogurt. Maybe because it's edible, but then it made the prop all smelly. But to make the creams erupt from the prop, I just cut little slithers in the boils from underneath and had a syringe full of cream. And then from below, I've just used the syringe to burst the cream out of the boils as I squeezed them. I could control the velocity at which the cream bursts out. It's an interesting sentence to say. I had to work out how I was going to make an edible gummy lung. So I began by making a monster clay sculpt of the lungs, and then I needed to make the mold. So I built the mold barrier around the edge. And then I used food-safe silicone to pour the mold. That way I could actually eat the gummy and not poison myself. So I removed the clay from the silicone mold and washed and cleaned the mold. And then I made a gelatin mix with some red food dye to make the gummy. And I poured that into the mold and let it set. And here we have our beautiful fizzy lung gummy. And it tasted gross because it was unflavored gelatin, but it looked quite good. Next we have gummy earworms, and the challenge with this one was to make a stop motion gummy grow out of my ear. So I started, of course, by building the worm out of clay, obviously, and getting him ready for molding. Same process again to make a little plaster of Paris mold of the worm. So when the mold was cleaned out and ready to go, I got a length of armature wire which I suspended kind of half in the mold. And then I mixed up some pink silicone and then poured it into the mold so the wire was in the center of the pink silicone. And then once that was dried, I pulled it out of the mold and we had our little silicone gummy worm with a piece of armature wire in the middle so I could pose and animate him. But for the final touches, I wanted to add some sugar to the worm. But glue doesn't stick to silicone. Not much does stick to silicone. The only thing that really does is more silicone. So I mixed up another batch of silicone and coated it round the worm. That way the sugar would stick to the wormy fella. And then we have our little stop motion wormy puppet, which I animated in front of a green screen and superimposed it coming out of my ear. And the challenge with this one was working out how to get a tiny demon inside a lollipop. So first I started by building the demon, and I used the same process of sculpting the demon, making a plaster mold of him, pouring latex into the mold, and then removing it from the mold. So I originally made 3, with the idea being that I would have one version of the lolly with him fully imprisoned, another version with the lolly half licked down, so he's kind of sticking out the top, and then a final one was going to be him fully released, stood in the background behind me, blown up and made to look large. But that didn't work, so I bailed on that, so I just had 3 demons for no reason. But I painted all 3 of these demons anyway. took one of the 3 demons and I used him as a basis to build a lollipop mold. I used him to build a clay lollipop. And then I made a mold of the clay lollipop out of silicone rubber. Then when the silicone was dry, I removed the clay and I had a lollipop mold. I cut into the bottom of the silicone and pushed a lollipop stick into the silicone mold, and I poured a clear resin into the mold. And then once that was dried, I removed it with the lollipop stick and we had our lollipop. I needed a blank lollipop and one with a demon in it. So once I knew the mold worked, I then tried the mold again by suspending the demon inside the mold and pouring resin in there again. I didn't want the face of the demon to be floating out the top of the resin, so I glued him into the bottom so he didn't float up after I poured the resin. And then once this dried, I removed the demon lollipop from the silicone mold, and there we had our imprisonment pop. Our really large, oversized lollipop with a demon inside. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed watching the process of all these props. It was fun. The process. It took a long time, but I enjoyed it. And if you do fancy seeing more of what goes on in my workshop in between videos, and you want to just help support the workshop, then head on over to my Patreon page. But like I say, I'm working on new videos at the moment. If you want to see the process of those being built as I'm working on them, and you want to support the channel and the workshop, then head on over to my Patreon page. And thank you to my patrons. You are awesome. But if you don't, that's cool. Thanks for watching the video anyway, and you're still awesome. Okay, thank you, bye.